All right, so yeah, we'll kick underway. Obviously, we thought we did an amazing podcast with Melinda, but then nobody could hear it, so we thought we should do it again. And we'll do it. Well, we'll do it differently this time. We can do it live, so we can answer questions from those present. But yeah, Melinda, we might just let you take it away. And I guess there's some gold in what you had to tell us, but unfortunately, everyone had to listen really hard to not hear it. So, but yeah, maybe if we could just start with what you're recommending at the moment, maybe, and out and about there, what you're seeing, what the sort of big problems are.
So I think, no surprise really. I guess finances are a big constraint for most systems at the moment. And in regards to just actually really making some strategic decisions where money to be spent where it needs to be, and then saved where it's not going to make an impact in terms of long-term profitability or production for this season, and to kind of just get through till the next. For a lot of guys, stock prices obviously haven't gone in a lot of people's favor, so yeah, just ensuring everyone doesn't make any rash decisions based on what necessarily I guess a sales driven concept would be, and just look at the actual farm data and an educated strategy for this season. And and hopefully next season might see some price reductions in terms of product and stock increases, and then kind of reassess priorities then.
Yeah, I guess it feels like we can almost guarantee higher prices. Maybe guarantee is a big word, but we cycle down to a pretty low point, so you can expect that stock price will be better. I mean, we get these sort of times when you have people just basically cutting every cost, and fertilizer is one of those things that is, I was going to say, easy to cut out of the budget. Like, it's just a straight thing that you don't actually visually see necessarily. I guess, what are you saying if people are saying let's do nothing?
So I think I don't know if you were privy to hearing the Countrywide podcast before my bit got cut. It was there for a week until it made some companies very unhappy, but basically I was saying that essentially, fertilizer, to be fair, a lot of our farms aren't going to fall over if you cut that for a year or cut it back drastically. Again, strategy. Dairy systems are a little bit different. There's a huge amount of conventional dairy systems that are very reliant on continuous soluble fertilizers, and the soil base doesn't really have a great capacity to look after itself. So you've got to be a little bit more strategic in those environments. But with sheep, beef and hill country, for the most part, a lot of my guys are either not doing anything, liming, because lime is only going to strengthen your actual soil system and its resilience and nutrient turnover and retention naturally. It's landed cheaper than fertilizer, regardless of tonnage and flying costs. So it's very much an independent review on everyone's farm system. Someone who hasn't put any fertilizer on for the last 3 years, it's a different conversation. But yeah, if their farm system is in a decent place, skipping a year, you're not going to fall over. And again, as we touched on in the wonderful first podcast we did, no one heard, the Olsen P at the moment, I mean, it's used as a tool to drive what you need to put on your farm system, and it's just utterly irrelevant. So again, before you make a decision, make sure you've got the data. Pasture analysis, that's a big one. There's no point just looking in the soil and then assuming you know what's going on, because it doesn't work like that. But yeah, so I'm very much pushing for minimal input wherever possible. And in the other half of that podcast, they were pushing for all the input, because if you don't put fertilizer on, you will have an issue.
Yeah, cool. So the good thing about us is we're not going to cut any of this. It's all going as is, and we have no axe to grind in terms of sales. But I guess, yeah, we did talk about Olsen P. Olsen P is something that everyone would have heard. It'd be good to retell your story around why Olsen P is not a good measure of I guess of your fertilizer strategy or your current soil system.
Yeah, so I mean, with an Olsen P, it should be very well known that in terms of its testing methodology, it's tested at a pH of 8.5 in the lab, and that's where it then reads how much plant availability you've got in your soil. The history of the Olsen P was back in the 50s in North America, where they've got a lot of alkaline soils, and so we're talking about kind of pH 8 and above. And so when you've got an alkaline soil, uh, you've got a lot of calcium in your soil. And what happens at that particular pH is the calcium doesn't actually release the phosphorus for the plants. It essentially fixes the phosphorus in the soil when it's in an alkaline solution, and the plants struggle to extract the sufficient volume of phosphorus it needs. So the Olsen P was designed to mimic that exact scenario, and that's why the labs convert your soil pH to a pH of 8.5 and then read how much phosphorus is extracted from that. In an acidic soil, which New Zealand and much of Australia are very much acidic, a completely different kettle of fish. The calcium is actually required to release the phosphorus, and it doesn't lock up phosphorus on any level in an acidic solution. What you do have, however, is your iron, your aluminium, your manganese. They all form oxides and compete with phosphorus. And so they are the ones that actually prevent the plant extraction. They are not read in an Olsen P test, whereas the Olsen P obviously claims the calcium fixes it. So it can both overestimate and underestimate in any given circumstance. I do actually, if it's any help, Mark, I would have a little bit of a picture just to kind of illustrate those differences and pH, to give a bit of a view, if you think that would help those watching.
Yeah, if you've got a screen share, that'd be awesome, I think.
So essentially, this little graph here, it just kind of gives a lot of hills, if you like, and each hill is representative of where the elements are locking up the phosphorus and taking that away from the plants being able to extract it. So in an acidic environment, you've got your iron, you've got aluminium, you've got your manganese coming down here in the yellow line as well. And it kind of shows in terms of as an optimum reduction of your iron, aluminium, and manganese, your pH for your phosphorus in particular would be around 6.8 if you want to get the maximum amount of plant availability. That's not to say every farm can get to a pH of 6.8, but what it does say is if you're at a pH of 6.2, 6.3, liming can still be very beneficial. The problem is with the Olsen P is that it is actually red where this red line is here. And so this little hill of calcium takes away the phosphorus that is available to your plants on farm, but in the lab isn't available. And so that's how it can quite drastically underestimate what you've got if you've got a good calcium based soil, or if you're a regular liming, if you've got a regular lime system, or if you're an RPR or high calcium fertilizer input. The Olsen Ps quite often underestimate what you've got. Whereas in the scenario where it doesn't acknowledge any of these, it can overestimate what you've got. And it also depends as well what you have from a soil type. Your bulk density can vary and make it even less accurate as well. So that's kind of where, in terms of an Olsen P, I have a little bit of an issue with, kind of recommendations based on an Olsen P are quite often not really looking at the full picture. So the options you have there is to add on additional tests. One which in New Zealand we have the resin P, which is very good in the sense it's just a water extraction that's done at the farm's pH. There's no manipulation, so you don't have to kind of think about how all of this in the graph and those hills are actually impacting it. It is what it is as it's recorded. In terms of a Aussie soil, they can do the DGT, which is very similar, so done at the farm's pH with no manipulation and very well correlated with plant availability. And then to take it a step further, you can also do what's called a total P, because the issue with the both the Olsen P, resin P, or DGT is that they only look at a very small portion of your soil phosphorus, and there's a whole lot more that you can actually look at in terms of fuel in the tank as well. So if I just maybe jump down to this one by here, excuse me going back and forth, I'm not particularly tech savvy on oh, now I've lost it altogether, tech savvy on PowerPoint. So this just kind of the little yellow blob, that would be anything, any form of plant available test. So whether it's your Olsen, your Colwell, which is very similar to Olsen, done at the pH of 8.5, but it's a longer extraction, so it would be more reliable than an Olsen P, but still doesn't take into consideration how the chemistry behaves in an acidic soil. So all of it is just a very small available portion, whereas you've also got kind of your active organic fraction, where everything is from organic and becoming inorganic in terms of plant availability. And then you've got your fixed phosphorus pool, which is comprised of your organic status, and some is humus, which will never become available, whereas some of it will in time become plant available under the right conditions. And that's a much bigger portion, obviously, of what you've got in the soil. So it does give a better indicator of the balance between plant availability, turnover, and your total soil phosphorus pool. If your total P, that big fixed phosphorus pool, is exceptionally high and your resin or your Olsen P is very low, it would be a symptom, if you like, of nutrient accumulation as opposed to utilization. And that's typically due to lack of soil calcium. So that can occur even at a pH of 6 or 6.2. You can be accumulating phosphorus because your soil chemistry will actually behave more readily and efficiently with more calcium in it. And pH again is quite an inaccurate means to determine the soil calcium because it's so variable as well. But on the Olsen P as well, are you okay for me to just carry on flicking through a bit of slides if they're relevant? So this here is, a lot of people in New Zealand would be aware of this. It's one of the or the combined calibration of the research that devised where the optimal range of Olsen P should be. In terms of, so this red box here is where our fertilizer cooperatives like to claim the actual optimal Olsen P is, whereas the research doesn't support that, and the research didn't conclude that either. So a lot of the farms can obtain 97% of their productivity with Olsen Ps, well under 20, half of which can be under 10, and they still obtain near full production economically. And the reason why it is so variable is because it is an inaccurate means to determine how phosphorus behaves in an acidic soil. So this study, in terms of all of the trials that they did, only 2 of them came out where you could agree an Olsen P of 20 to 30 would be an ideal optimum range. Everything else came in well below that, and in fact, this one down here, you could argue it was anywhere between kind of 3 to 10, where most of the maximum production was gained. And these are different soil types, which is where you've got the variation. And as I say, these green lines are where the optimum 20 to 30 from the co-ops is put in. And that's quite a scary factor for a lot of farms when their Olsen Ps are naturally low, regardless of continuous fertilizer, capital input, no improvements in Olsen P. Liming also will decrease the Olsen P based on that theory we've discussed already, where you've got a pH of 8.5 and the calcium locks up the phosphorus at that alkaline pH. So when you do liming, your Olsen P reduces, and that's quite often a bit of a scaremongering kind of insight in terms of what's really going on. So the resin P and the total P, or the DGT and total P, if you're in Australia, are really useful to just get a bit of clarity on what's really going on, and highlight that the Olsen P can in fact be really sort of discouraging and inaccurate in terms of where that money is best spent as well.
I was expecting questions. I haven't
The
thought of
balance trap surely has something, Russell.
one.
No, I think there's definitely a correlation between optimal Olsen P on stock classes and economic and economic optimums. There's a massive difference between what is achievable in terms of a tonnes of dry matter grown on flat grassland, example dairy farm, as opposed to a steep hill country sheep and beef farm. And optimal Olsen P, there's a very, very, very difference of what is to be expected and what an economic input is to a varied rate of tons of dry matter and ME grown. So to a degree, I do agree.
So I think in terms of, and this was done on a dry matter. This was done on a lot of the research is done on a dry matter basis, but actually concluded the Olsen P is not an accurate determinant of farm production, because you can see how much variation is in there. And I guess to take it a step further, whenever you're focusing on farm profitability and production solely from a dry matter perspective, that's the other I guess catch with the fact that a higher yielding dry matter does not correlate to profits or healthier production, because it's actually what's in that dry matter. If you're not looking at it from a nutritional assessment for the objective of your farm, quite often, I mean, and the dairy industry is a prime example, even in terms of sheep and beef under irrigation, they put on a lot of nitrogen, they put on a lot of phosphorus, they grow a lot of dry matter, but phosphorus in high proportions is actually an irritant, in terms of an intestinal irritant. So it goes straight through them. They get shitty bums. And the same with nitrogen, the protein is just too much. They're actually wasting energy and having to intake more of that dry matter to make up for the energy wastage because of what was used to grow that dry matter. So, and again, the Olsen P can't predict that at all. That's where looking at the overall soil balance, calcium and phosphorus, magnesium and phosphorus ratios are all very important, because that is directly related to how your stock are actually going to grow and how healthy they're going to be. Phosphorus, when you're putting high amounts of phosphorus on, which is typical of an Olsen P driven system, that can depress the likes of calcium homeostasis. It reduces the ability of the stock to respond to sort of low calcium, low magnesium. It reduces the ability for them to respond to hormonal release when they have those low blood levels, and that can all be driven by over fertilization, because looking at one factor doesn't then take into consideration the holistic aspect of why we're farming.
So to navigate this minefield for the average farmer, what do? We ignore the FERT rep, or we get independent soil measurements, or
it's a matter of so getting those additional tests are really important. So basically, I mean, if to show a bit of an example, if we okay, so this one here, this is just looking at the likes of kind of a pH that would be considered optimal in our industry at 5.9. When you actually look at the calcium availability, its base saturation is only 43%, which is very, very low, and no soil is going to be functioning to its full capacity or have any true resilience for drought or greater levels of organic turnover and nutrient retention with those levels. Both the resin P and the Olsen P are excessive in this instance. And so then you think about it, and you decide, okay, well, is it due to over fertilizing, or is it the fact that it's accumulating and not being utilized? So when you actually look at the herbage, and this is a really big aspect of any decision-making process for fertilizer input, and of course the actual nutritional input as well. But if you don't look at your pasture or your crop analysis, you are flying blind. You don't actually know what's happening. So this correlated pasture analysis, you had excessive phosphorus in the soil, yet the pasture is actually deficient. And so then you've got to dive into thinking, okay, well, why are we putting all this money into phosphorus input, yet the pasture is still deficient? And that all comes down to the fact that calcium, when you looked at the calcium level as opposed to the pH, was showing very clearly it's actually really, really low. So it's just a matter of getting the right data and understanding that data, which is a big ask for farmers to do, because there's so much to know about the chemistry. It's just unfortunate that with our industry, they don't promote these other little pieces of information they're really, really vitally important for that decision making process. And this example here that I've got on the screen is just showing how big a difference you can have when you're looking at Olsen P. And if you're going to devise a fertilizer input and cost strategy based on Olsen P, and this Olsen P is 12. The range here for the co-ops is 20 to 30, and so you're kind of going to be looking at increasing that Olsen P by 8 units if you want to get into an optimal range. The resin P, on the other hand, shows that you're actually within an optimal standard, and the total phosphorus is kind of still within the optimal range as well. So you're looking at a difference between a capital dressing, which is significant, versus just maintenance input. In terms of checking if the pasture is adequate in phosphorus, it was actually high. So the Olsen P was saying it's deficient. The resin P and the total P was saying it's optimum, and the pasture is saying that it's got a very, very good level approaching that high mark. So again, from a financial point of view, it's just a matter of getting the data that you need to make that decision. And liming goes a long way to helping the utilization of that phosphorus. So relying on a pH can be a little bit misleading because, again, you've got the variability. If it's a dry season, it would be pushed down up to 0.2 units. Whereas if you're in a wetter season, it can kind of look better. Similarly, if you've got high potassium or high magnesium soils, that can falsely elevate your pH as well, and just make it look better than it truly is. So it's a matter of breaking down that actual calcium level again to know what you're truly working with.
Are there any soils that you're wasting your time on, Melinda?
Any soils wasting your time on?
Yeah. Like, so there's some soils where you're just uneconomic to do anything, or is that?
I mean, there's certainly soils where you would spend less on. I think, I mean, even in terms of sort of your steeper hill country and that, and it does come down to also the size of the farm. If you've got a 3,000 hectare farm, the reality is you're not necessarily going to be able to cover everything, and so then you do need to prioritize. If that wasn't an issue, then quite often a lot of soils can be improved, even if it was solely with the application of lime and no other inputs. It has been shown with New Zealand studies that the soil phosphorus can increase naturally just through liming, and that's because you're improving the organic state of your soil. It can turn over nutrients, it can utilize nutrients, it can break down nutrients, um, all a lot more readily than if you're kind of working with a bit of a stagnant acidity.
And I suppose I have a question, if you don't mind, Mark. As, in terms of, I suppose, maximising the potential of your stock on these pastures, it would just be good to have a bit of your knowledge on, when you are at peak grass, peak quality, what is the response in your livestock, and why is it worth doing all of this, to get that optimum pasture?
Yeah. So, I mean, especially when we have typical good growing seasons, and New Zealand's great to grow grass. I think what it's always pushed, obviously, pasture is the most efficient feed. But then it's also forgotten that when we do grow grass in our climate, it is typically very, very potent, if you like. And so in terms of even, again, the phosphorus, the potassium, they would be really major instigators for stock that are on grass, where they should look as if they're doing great, and they're dirty, they're just not doing so well. Both of those can be quite irritating, go through the system very, very quickly, offset all of the other nutrients. So again, with your phosphorus, you're kind of reducing the metabolics of your calcium and your magnesium, your potassium in terms of your magnesium. You also have a very quick flow of digester kind of through the system because of lack of fiber, essentially, and a lot of wet matter rather than dry matter. So not only does that potentially reduce the rumen's capacity to synthesize B12, for example, which is, if you don't have a great NDF level, your B12 synthesis reduces, the microbes just aren't able to do it. But also the rate of passage, it just flows too quickly to absorb the nutrients and synthesize all of those sort of goodies that the whole point of rumination does. So it's certainly very much needing to look at the pasture analysis, and that changes seasonally. So how often a farm system looks at that is a little bit dependent on really what they can do or are prepared to do to amend any imbalances. with a typical steep hill sort of sheep beef country, the reality is you're not going to be going out and supplementing feed or grain to offset high protein. But what you can do is actually check that your trace element status is as good as it can be for that farm system. And what you're doing at the moment is working, especially at times of really high importance in terms of kind of your tapping, your lambing, calving, etc. So there's a lot of trace elements that at times of year can be really good. But when we grow really good grass, it doesn't matter what your soil values are. They can be plentiful, but the ruminant just can't digest them.
What's your recommendation around timing and frequency of soil testing? Does it differ compared to conventional advice?
So soil testing, it doesn't really matter when you do that. It's more of a case of making sure you're consistent with the time of testing. So you've also you've got to take into account, and the reason you do it at the same time of year each time you do it is because if you take it in a dry soil, you're going to elevate the likes of that phosphorus, whereas if you take it in winter, it's not going to look so high because of that moisture difference. But you also have to obviously take into consideration great differences in climate. So in Hawke's Bay, anyone doing it in sort of the soil testing in spring or summer would normally be used to having a drier soil than what we've had in the last few years as well. So it's got to be always factored in any major differences and soil moisture differences. But so long as you're consistent, it's not a big deal. In terms of pasture, that's a lot more important and does then depend on the objective why you're doing it. If you're wanting to monitor a fertilizer or a nutrient input regime, spring, when it's really actively growing, so that's not kind of your September or even October at the moment. It's typically once the nighttime temperatures are more consistently warmer, you've still got moisture in the soil, but it's really pumping. That's the best time to look at your pasture, and a clover only, especially for a fertilizer assessment, if you like, to make sure what it's doing or how your soil nutrients are behaving in the plant and how it's uptaking. Any deficiencies are likely to show more at that time of year because it's growing as fast as it grows. Clover only, again, is a lot more useful for that. You're looking at one species. We know in terms of its low optimum and high requirements, and again, when it's growing actively, it's going to highlight any issues easier. If you're looking at it from a nutritional point of view for your stock, all seasons are relevant, but again, that will then come down to the system and whether there's ability to actually make changes. So if you're not really going to be able to implement anything to make any difference, you could just do that the same time of year you do your clover only testing. If you have any unexpected health issues or lag in growth, then you can take it, and it's all very relevant. But yeah, so it's a little bit more dependent on objective.
Great, thanks, Melinda. Any other questions out there?
I'd just like to ask, I've had a few people talking recently about the role of silica in the fertiliser. Would you like to comment on that?
There's a fair bit of research internationally on it because it would be really useful. It's very handy in terms of plant immunity. The problem is it's very immobile, and so even if you apply it from a foliar standpoint, it doesn't typically go to where it's needed. So there are a lot of well, there are some companies that claim to utilize it with great success. The science as it stands doesn't support that, just because they're unable to find a means to get it in active transport. There is a company in the UK who have managed to have a bit of a breakthrough, from my understanding, which I did a little bit of reading back a little while ago on it, but can't remember the precise details for you. But yeah, I mean, it has potential, but the issue is the movement within the plant. And even if you put it in the soil itself, again, getting it through the root zone to where it needs to have an impact, that's where we have some issues. But it has been shown to be an important element. But yeah, just a tricky one.
Anything else you want to add, Melinda, before we call it quits?
Was there anything in particular you were wanting to discuss from our first? I think we might have covered most of it. I think just the matter of actually looking at a few more soil tests in terms of accuracy, knowing what you're working with. But the main point is to follow that nutrient flow, making sure whatever is in the soil and what you're paying to put in the soil is flowing through that whole system. So it needs to go from the soil to the plant, and then most importantly, it needs to be essentially in a efficient form for a digestive capacity, and making you money out the gate. And that's where the pasture analysis is a big step in that. And then from there, you can devise the kind of the health of the animal, and where the opportunity for potential lies. And I remember kind of mentioning last time that genetics play a huge role in the potential of stock production. But if they're not fed well, or there are some even trace element deficiencies are quite common here. Iodine is a particular one that hasn't been given much attention, but in Australia they've shown that there's significant losses with no clinical symptoms or thyroid symptoms of deficiency at all. So it's a matter of actually looking into those details that can be lost opportunity. And also, I guess it's quite prudent to keep in mind when you're looking at whether it's a soil test or a pasture analysis, those bar charts that they provide you, they're only, well, some of them aren't necessarily optimum ranges, they're average ranges. And so that's quite a big difference in the sense an average range is all of the figures that have been collected through the lab from top to tail of the country, and averaged and given you kind of that medium range. That's entirely irrelevant for individual farm systems. So it's always a good idea to know what you're actually looking at. And then the other issue with just referring to the bar charts, which are kind of where everyone's eye is drawn to, often you don't, a lot of people don't know the optimum ranges off by heart. So they look at those bar charts assuming it's going to guide them in the right direction. The other big concern is that they only look at a element in isolation. And so you may have an optimum range and you may be within that optimum range, but you may actually need more than what it says is optimum because you've got another nutrient that has significantly offset that. And calcium and phosphorus are another prime example of that. Your calcium may be what is considered optimum, but your phosphorus high. And so when you look at the pasture analysis and the ratios and the nutritional impact from that, it's actually calcium deficient. So it's just a matter of keeping everything in context and knowing what you're actually looking at and the objective for that as well.
Yeah, awesome. Any other questions?
Just listening to this, I just wonder, can you have too much calcium?
Yeah, so an alkaline soil, you would have kind of the opposite issues to what many of us have. you would have to have a very alkaline soil. So in terms of pH, you're actually looking at a pH of 8, well above 7.5, to have significant impact. In saying that, if you have a pH of 7, the calcium content is great. That in isolation won't do any harm. But if you're phosphorus deficient, so we're kind of going on the opposite end of the scale now, if you're phosphorus deficient, then yes, your calcium could be offsetting that phosphorus. But I'm yet to see in any of the work I've done in New Zealand and the few farms in Aussie, I'm yet to see a soil that is too high in calcium, in the sense you can't work with it and it's unhealthy.
Melinda, just wondering about cobalt and selenium deficiencies. We have a few issues here with it. What are your thoughts on it?
So cobalt can be, is the cobalt deficiency have you seen it low in the pasture, or is it more determined from a low B12?
Well, as soon as we give them a B12, they give a real boost, and the selenium's the same.
Okay, so with the cobalt, there are a couple of scenarios. So your soil may genuinely be low in cobalt, and that's what's driving a low pasture cobalt. Or quite often the soil cobalt is sufficient to put in enough into the pasture. So pasture analysis would be a very helpful tool to look at that. If your cobalt is technically sufficient in that pasture, I would suspect that the manganese level is significantly high, and that will counteract your cobalt. So this is a little bit of an example again of those optimal levels and actually needing to look at it in a bigger picture. So you may have cobalt there and technically optimum, but if your manganese level, which if you've got an acidic pH, a lot of our soils are very high in manganese, a little bit geography dependent. But if you've got high manganese, that will be counteracting any cobalt you do have. The other aspect to consider is if it's seasonal. So while cobalt is needed for synthesis of B12, if you've got that flush I was talking about earlier and you don't have a lot of fiber in the diet, you could have ample cobalt for synthesis, but the rumen microbes don't have enough fiber to actually synthesize the B12. And so then you're still B12 deficient, and you will get that pick-me-up with B12 injections. So it's a matter of looking at your pasture and understanding what's going on there, and also having a look at the actual calcium base saturation in your soil test. So if you don't have pasture analysis to look at, go back to your soil tests. If your calcium base saturation is below that kind of 70%, or especially if it's below your 60%, that's quite likely to be driving an issue with that antagonism of cobalt. With selenium typically deficient in soils, so if you fertilize, it can be a very effective means of increasing that pasture sufficiently for at least low production, so not necessarily in terms of a dairy high performing dairy cow system. They'll probably need higher selenium, but the consideration with any fertilizer input selenium is that it is very variable dependent on soil type, pH, other factors that aren't necessarily known. You can have I've got a particular road where I had every farm on the road I was working with, all but one had perfect selenium levels in the herbage through the selenium prills, except one. and it didn't matter how much you put in, you could quadruple. There's quite a bit of room for play with a selenium prill in the fertilizer, so long as you're not dosing as well. But in terms of, you could double the dose or triple the dose, and there still was no improvement in the herbage analysis. And it was just that particular farm, the soil just wasn't good at actually unlocking that selenium, and so it was essentially a waste of money for them to continue doing that. So if you haven't started a fertilizer regime with selenium, but you're interested to see if that will fix the problem, which can be quite effective for most, I always recommend, once you first start it, to herbage test about 4 months later, where essentially you should be getting the peak of where it's at. And then if you test the pasture again another 6 months later, you can then determine if it's kind of starting to drop off, or if it's already out of the system, in which case you haven't gotten that year's worth that you should theoretically from a fertilizer input. If you're not getting a year, then you need to determine if it's actually doing a good enough job, because you need to be covering both the likes of your mating and your lambing and calving, which is the times where they need it at the highest levels. So definitely worth exploring that pasture analysis to determine the root cause of your B12 deficiency, because there could be a few issues. Selenium, it's a matter of either fertilizing or supplementing directly. With the iodine and selenium, it's typically the other way around. So insufficient selenium can cause essentially a secondary iodine deficiency, even if you have sufficient iodine. But definitely agree in terms of knowing your iodine level. And it's a bit of a tricky one, because I guess much of our iodine knowledge is based around goiter and enlarged thyroids, and a lot of the vets are driven to kind of focus on that clinical ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Whereas from my perspective, you've got a long way to go before you're actually in a clinical state, and you've lost a lot of production before you get to that point. So getting a baseline of your iodine is very very important. And I've had a client not long ago where we were sort of talking about getting bloods done. The vet disagreed because they didn't think it would be worthwhile, because there's no clinical symptoms. We got the bloods done and they were incredibly low. So they will now be supplemented, which makes a huge difference in terms of overall health. I mean, your iodine drives your thyroid, but you do need sufficient selenium. So if you're off in that, it's still not going to have the effective impact it should. But it's growth, metabolism, in terms of reproduction, immunity, it's your thermoregulation, and that's where there's a lot of losses, lamb losses, that are kind of considered normal, I guess. Whereas if they're actually driving a subclinical deficiency, that can be a completely avoidable loss, and reasonably easily as well, if the ewe was treated sufficiently. Iodine, in terms of pre-tup iodine, really important to have it far enough out that when they do conceive, that it's actually incorporated into the fetus, because it's about 8 weeks. So it's too late to do it pre sort of post mating, because it won't be incorporated soon enough.
Excellent. How are we going for questions? We've rounded out the hour. Any other questions while we've got Melinda on?
How often do you come to Australia?
As often people want me to. I've worked at as far as Papua New Guinea, but I have to admit I wasn't quite so keen to jump on a plane there. But yeah, no, I've done a little bit of work with Australia.
The Eyre Peninsula is sort of like Papua New Guinea.
What was that, sorry?
I said the Eyre Peninsula is like Papua New Guinea. It's just hard to get to.
Before we leave, Melinda, would you mind sharing how people could get in touch with you if they want, for people listening and watching?
Yep, by all means. So if you do a little Google of my name, it will probably come up with a LinkedIn link or Facebook page for my my business, Farm Nutrient Advisory. Otherwise, my email is Melinda, Melinda @ farmnutrients.co.nz.